Hey everyone, welcome to the Good Trouble Show. As most of our viewers know, we love to cover the whole political thing, but we also love to cover the topic of UAPs, otherwise known as UFOs. Today, I am super excited to have a very special Canadian journalist join us who broke a very big story this morning. We are also excited to announce our upcoming interview with Stanford professor Dr. Gary Nolan. Gary Nolan is considered one of the leading cancer researchers and has done a lot of work on the whole UAP issue for the CIA, Congress, and others, just to name a few. Our pre-recorded interview will air March 26th. But before we get going, of course, we appreciate your super chats, super stickers, and super thanks. Your donations help cover the cost of producing this show. And of course, please hit that subscribe and thumbs up button and tell all your friends about our show too. We would love for you to spread the word. So you can also find us on Twitter at Good Trouble. I can't talk this morning. At Good Trouble Show. It's a mouthful. So let's get to it. So we are honored to have an exclusive interview with the journalist that broke the news this morning that the Canadian government will be studying the UAP UFO issue. Please welcome our neighbor up north, investigative journalist Daniel Otis. Daniel, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
Doing good. We had a bit of a late night last night. We were on Spaced Out Radio with Dave, so talking to another Canadian friend. So it was, it was a lot of fun. How's the weather up there? It's been raining like crazy down here in LA.
Looking out the window, a little bit of snow. Hopefully things are warming up.
Nice. Okay, so you're a very well-known journalist. You've written some really big written for some really big publications. So tell us a bit about your work and who you've written for.
Yeah, sure. I've been working as a journalist for over a decade. I've worked out of two of Canada's busiest newsrooms, CTV News and the Toronto Star. I also spent about 3 years freelancing from Southeast Asia, predominantly working on stories from Cambodia and Burma, Myanmar. I've written the whole gamut of really everything there is to write as a journalist. And during the pandemic, over the past 2 or so years, I started looking into Canadian, UFO, UAP files. Very much inspired by some of the reporting I'd seen out of the United States, I decided to, take journalistic tools and try to see if there was anything to uncover up here. And lo and behold, there are reports, there are procedures, lots of interesting things.
So what made you wake up one day and decide, you know what, I'm going to start writing about UAPs as well? What was there an event that triggered it? Did you see something outside your window? What sparked your interest in writing about this?
Yeah, it was, the subject had always kind of been in the back of my head growing up in the 1990s. I'd watch the X-Files and then stay up all night with nightmares. But from a professional perspective, I didn't really think of it as something worthy of journalistic investigation, for a long time. I was aware of the New York Times coverage in 2017, which kind of opened the door up to serious journalism on the subject. But, a decade into my career, it would have been, I think it was April 2020, when the Pentagon released a press release confirming the veracity of some videos that had been previously published by the New York Times. In that release, the Pentagon basically said, yes, these were taken with instruments aboard fighter jet aircraft. And yes, we're not sure what they are. And when I saw that kind of official acknowledgement, it literally split my skull open to the possibilities of this subject as being worthy of, serious journalistic investigation. I started Googling everything I could, started reading everything I could, and I quickly realized that while there were some great reporters handling the subject in the United States, nobody was really taking a look at the subject from a journalistic lens up here in Canada. So I literally spent about a year doing research, filing freedom of information requests, what we call access information requests here in Canada. And once the results of that started coming in, I started publishing on the topic, and there's been no looking back.
And speaking about the freedom of information requests, one thing I know out here in the United States is that if you want any information about the operation of NORAD, North American was it radar special defense, or I don't remember the acronym, but my understanding is that that's not the case in Canada. And of course, Canada is a partner with the United States and NORAD. So is that true that you're able to dig up information, especially about the UAP subject on NORAD, that we cannot do through FOIA here in the United States?
Yeah, that is sort of true. Just some background for your listeners. NORAD is the joint Canada-U.S. predominantly aerospace defense organization that, since I guess it was the late 1950s, they've been in charge of, monitoring North American airspace for incoming threats and responding to them. And I think NORAD really, came to public prominence just, last month when we saw this suspected Chinese spy balloon and 3 unidentified objects get shot out of the sky. In the U.S., because it's a binational organization, NORAD is not subject to American Freedom of Information laws. That's correct. Technically, NORAD isn't, but in Canada, interestingly, the Royal Canadian Air Force and NORAD have a lot of joint functions. So there's, specific units and squadrons that operate as what they call combined air operation centers, where you have, people wearing Air Force hats and NORAD hats sort of existing in this combined role. So what essentially I can do to access Canadian NORAD information is targeting the specific Canadian Air Force units and squadrons that are affiliated with NORAD. And that's how I've been able to get, logbook entries detailing pilots, commercial pilots seeing things. I've been able to get procedural information about, what they do and how to handle these reports, precisely because our NORAD and Air Force operates in these combined functions, whereas in the United States, you'll see facilities that are in Colorado, for example, that are completely dedicated to NORADs, which can never be touched by a Freedom of Information request. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. You did a lot better. You explained it much better than I did. I've never said this publicly, and I can't tell you how, but I've been inside Cheyenne Mountain, which is the facility. Normally, NORAD runs out of Peterson Air Force Base. They changed that after 9/11 when they realized they needed more people in the facility. But it was about I think like 5 years ago. I got a tour of Cheyenne Mountain, and it was the coolest thing I think I've ever seen. It was something else. Now, the one thing that
if you get another invite, tell them you want to bring a guest, okay?
I'll let you know for sure. Now, of course, I think a lot of people, at least here in the United States, a lot of people think that this UFO topic, UFO hubbub, or UAP, what the Pentagon likes to call them now, is mainly an American issue. But I think what a lot of people don't understand is that this is a worldwide issue. This is not just happening here in the United States of America. How prominent is, because I just don't seem to hear a lot about it. How prominent is the UFO topic, or how common are UFO encounters in Canada?
I mean, how prominent is news from other countries in the U.S. period? Maybe, but
right.
As you said, it's a worldwide issue, right? Through my research, I've been able to find aviation reports filed to government authorities from pilots on Air Canada, WestJet, Delta, KLM, United, you name it. I've been able to find reports like that going back to at least the mid-1990s. Through my Freedom of Information request work here, I found Canadian military reports spanning 70 years. Reports as recently as the 2020s to as early as the 1950s. One of those cases I find particularly interesting. There's a Canadian NORAD affiliated Air Force base here in my province, Ontario, called 22 Wing North Bay. I found reports from this one particular base from 1952 and from 2007. Both involved multiple witnesses, and genuinely, the 1952 report was the weirder of the two. 55 years earlier, all of this data just sort of highlights that there's a degree of a historical continuity, that a lot of people have been seeing similar types of things decade after decade after decade. And, it also highlights that this is, certainly not an American issue. These sorts of reports have been filed from all over Canada. We have a much larger landmass than you folks, from the Arctic to the Pacific to the Atlantic and everywhere in between. And I think that really does just highlight, these sorts of sightings happen everywhere on this planet.
Okay, so we're going to get into your story here in a minute. But one question that came to mind is, so here in the United States, you had the Air Force ran this study called Project Blue Book, which was essentially a farce. And at the end of Project Blue Book, which I believe it closed in like 1969, 1970, somewhere in there, the gist of it was, this is just swamp gas, Venus, nothing to see here. We're not going to look into this subject anymore. So for the longest time, we here in the U.S. thought that, okay, the government was done with this. The Pentagon isn't looking into it. And then, of course, the bombshell article in 2017 by Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal on the front page of the New York Times said, oh, but yeah, it turns out the Pentagon has been studying the UAP or the UAP UFO phenomenon with this program, this black budget program called ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Now, I think that started around in 2007, but I've heard that the U.S. has had plenty of programs prior to that. Do you think that something similar has existed in Canada or currently exists in Canada? A sort of UAP program run by your Ministry of Defense that the public isn't aware of? What's your sort of gut feeling on that?
Yeah, my understanding is there was historical interest, that Canada's Department of National Defense did look into reports for a bit, and they did so during the Cold War. They wanted to be able to decipher what was, legitimate threats from the Soviet Union versus, other sorts of clutter and et cetera. So there were efforts during that period. Canadian research efforts appeared to fizzle out around 1995. There was also another program called Project Magnet that looked into the phenomena a bit, but official interest sort of petered out. I think it was the military determined that some of these sightings didn't represent Soviet incursions, and so from the national security perspective, they kind of lost interest. Then from the period of about 1995, and I guess until relatively recently, reports still continued to come into relevant Canadian departments like the Air Force and transportation officials, but there was no effort to sort of centralize them, to collate them, to analyze them, et cetera. Up until with the story I just released today on what's being called the Sky Canada project. So, as far as I know, this is the first official Canadian look at the subject in nearly 30 years. Now, I've heard rumors about other sorts of programs existing, but I have no evidence in hand that anything has existed over the past 30 so years.
Got it. Okay. So, all right. So you just mentioned this. So today you broke the story. Oops, our little things messed up here. So today you broke the story that the Canadian government has launched its own study of the UAP phenomenon. So what can you tell us about this study as we try and fix our video here?
Yeah, the study is being called the Sky Canada Project. It's being launched by the Office of the Chief Science Advisor of Canada. This was a post that was created in about 2017 to provide independent scientific advice to the Prime Minister, Minister of Science, and the Prime Minister's cabinet. This is a arm's length independent office, and they seem to be interested in this subject. Basically, what their project is going to be, based on 9 pages of slides outlining it that were provided to me by a government source who's asked not to be named. This person who has knowledge of the project basically says they're going to be reaching out to different, departments and agencies within the Canadian government that might have material or procedures or things like that to try and find out, one, what's being done with these types of reports in Canada, and two, to offer recommendations for improvements if necessary. And I think that's the key point there. My research has shown that reports continue to come in to aviation officials and defense officials year after year after year. But unless, something represents a very clear and credible threat or a clear safety incident, for example, a plane takes an evasive maneuver, unless it meets that very high threshold for being something actionable by authorities, they're not going to look into it. So, I'd say over 90% of the reports that come in, they get filed away and then just collect dust. So what I hope what this project does is that it is sort of able to sort of provide a bird's eye view of all the different organizations that are receiving reports, which include the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Transport Canada, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Canadian Space Agency, possibly even more. I found reports from the Coast Guard, for example.
Wow.
Hopefully they recommend that there be some sort of centralized effort so that these reports can be collected, standardized, and made available for the sake of scientific study. That's my hope, but I have no idea what they're ultimately going to do. But how it's presented in these slides, they say that they're going to spend this year studying the issue, and that they're going to release a final public report in the winter or spring of 2024. So in a little over a year from now, we should have a clear idea of what these recommendations are going to be.
And so what exactly is the Office of the Chief Science Advisor of Canada? I know very little about how your government runs, especially defense and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's sort of a unique office. It was created specifically to provide independent scientific advice to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. The idea of it is that it sort of acts at arm's length from the government, and it produces, in addition to providing advice, it's also meant to promote scientific independence from government, and they produce reports. They've produced multiple reports on the COVID-19 pandemic, on things like vaccines. They've done a report on aquaculture. They've done a lot of work on open science initiatives. And, I guess in the spirit of open science, they want to look into UAP.
Yeah, I mean, as they definitely should. I mean, that's something we've, I think, all of us for quite a while have been pushing for here, especially all of us that are activists in this particular subject. Now, you were talking about it. It sort of sounds like, in a way, this is sort of similar to the UAP program that we have here being run out of the Pentagon, ATIP, or All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, and that office functioning as kind of the nexus for all of this data coming in from similar agencies. Does it sound like it's kind of a similar architecture to the Aero office, or a little bit different?
I would say it's very different. This is going to be a scientific-based study. This is not a military or coming from a military or national defense perspective. In addition to that, they've made it very clear they have no intention of collecting reports or transforming the Science Advisor's Office into the primary office responsible for collecting these sorts of reports. I think what they're simply going to do is take a look at how these things are being handled, and they're going to offer recommendations for improvements. That, I think, is the scope of their mandate. They are not looking to transform themselves into a UAP research body like the Pentagon has created. I think this is going to be a much sort of higher level look aimed at improving data collection in Canada.
Do you have any sense? I know recently there have been reports that that our ATIP office here, went on a sort of hiring spree. I think they're up to like 35 folks, or they're going to hire 35, 40, somewhere in that neighborhood. Is there any indication how large this office will be that's being established?
Well, the office is going to fall completely within the Office of the Chief Science Advisor of Canada. It's my understanding that they will not be seeking extra personnel or an extra budget to do this. They're going to do this. They have a staff of about 20, I believe, in a budget of about 4 million Canadian dollars a year. And a lot of the advisors that they've collected are a lot of people with PhDs in various scientific fields. So my understanding that this is going to be produced in-house with the existing budget, which I think is great news. In Canada, our government and military and scientific operations operate on a little more shoestring budgets, I think, than they do in the United States. And I think it would be a pretty tough sell to justify spending additional money on something like this, when there's kids who sleep under bridges and don't have fresh drinking water. The fact that this is being done within an existing office using existing resources, I think is great news. And I think it'll allow the project to receive more support in Ottawa because they don't have to justify additional costs for it.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Now, you were saying earlier, if I heard correctly, there are going to be two versions of the report, one that's classified and one that is unclassified. Is that correct, or is it all one report?
It's not clear to me. The slides themselves in a timeline, I have them in front of me, they say that, in the fall of 2023, they plan to draft a report for internal discussion, and in the winter or spring of 2024, they plan to make a final report public. Will there be a classified version? I don't know. I don't know. I would expect that would not be within the spirit of accessible science. And I think to produce a secondary classified report would sort of fall outside of that mandate. But I can't tell you for certain. What I do know is that in the winter or spring, we are going to see a final public report from these folks, which I really look forward to.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's definitely a step in the right direction. And I think kind of with all of this stuff, you're not going to get everything that you want. So it's, sort of incremental baby steps. But I think it's fantastic. Now, I understand it was one person in your government that sort of mandated this thing or started the whole thing. What can you tell us about this gentleman?
Yeah, well, just to rewind back to a question you asked before, I think this project is going to be a lot more akin to what NASA is doing with the subject.
Right. Taking
a scientific look, using unclassified data, identifying what data sources exist, what sensors exist, what expertise exists within the scientific community. I really think it's going to be much more akin to the NASA program, which is, based on open science and producing public reports, as opposed to military programs, which tend to not really tell us very much. So I'm hopeful in that regard. And as to the question you just asked, yeah, I think there were multiple inspirations for this project, but one of the primary motivators has been a conservative member of federal parliament from the province of Manitoba named Larry Maguire. Mr. Maguire has been advocating for a scientific-based UAP program in Canada since at least May 2022. He wrote an op-ed specifically calling on the Chief Science Advisor's office to study this. He mentioned the exact same thing in a parliamentary committee meeting. And in addition to that, he wrote a letter addressed to the Chief Science Advisor herself, requesting that she look into it. I think the office has shown an interest. The records I've seen show that they've really started inquiring on the topic a year earlier, approximately in mid-2021. But I think Mr. McGuire's very, very public requests to the Chief Science Advisor really helped, I think, push this forward. He's mentioned twice in the slides, one as being a motivation, and two, some of the media coverage. Actually, a story I wrote about Mr. McGuire's advocacy was hyperlinked right into the slide. Wow. So he's certainly one of several motivations. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. I was curious if there exists any sort of public pressure on the politicians out there, or what level of interest there is from the Canadian public on this particular issue, and how much that sort of helped kickstart this whole thing.
It's hard to say. Mr. McGuire certainly has been the most outspoken voice in Ottawa on the subject. I think you could, compare him to, for example, Senator Marco Rubio in terms of the amount of advocacy and, unprompted appearances they've made on it. And interestingly, in Canada, just like in the United States, there seems to be very strong bipartisan interest in Canada as well. The difference, though, in Ottawa, members of parliament, generally speaking, don't operate and speak as independently as they do in the United States. There's, usually most things have to go through the leader's office. So yes, there's bipartisan interest, but we don't always see it. We are seeing it from McGuire because, frankly, he's been pretty much the most courageous elected official in Canada on this subject currently. In terms of the public interest, I can tell you anecdotally, when I write on the subject, there's always a great deal of interest. But I don't think we have the same level of awareness overall in Canada as we do, as people do in the United States, where, this has been part of the news cycle for a couple of years now. Here, it's less so. But I think one of the main reasons that, the study is going public is probably because of the heightened attention brought by, the shooting down of the suspected Chinese balloon and those 3 unidentified objects. I think that made it very clear to people who hadn't been paying attention that, there are unidentified things making incursions into North American airspace. And even if they are just all balloons, it is totally 100% worthwhile to expend efforts to investigate and study these things, because of, the security implications. So I think with that recent news cycle in mind, I think it, provided adequate justification and motivation to go public with this project.
Did the whole shoot down of the balloons, how prominent was that in the media? I mean, here it was literally all over the television and in just about every publication. Was it as a big a thing up there?
Yeah, absolutely. This was big news
Cool.
up here, and as we mentioned before, this was all the detecting, et cetera. This was done by NORAD. NORAD is a joint Canada-U.S. organization. The commander of NORAD is American always, and the deputy commander is always a Canadian, right? They answer to the president and the prime minister. And it was big news here too. One of these objects was shot down over the Yukon Territory in Canada's extreme northwest. Another one was shot down over Lake Huron, which forms a border with Canada.
Right.
We were involved in those search efforts. It really dominated the news cycle, and I can tell you anecdotally, I had a lot of friends and colleagues in that week coming up to me and saying, oh my goodness, Daniel, you've been on this for
Right.
2 years. You were
That's
right.
awesome. Right.
Which it was validating.
Right.
My work is void of speculation. I try to just dig up data and present it as it is. I don't try to come to conclusions about what these things may or may not be. I'm interested in the data that sheds light on the mystery. So it was it was very interesting to hear people finally say, yeah, like this is something we should be paying attention to, because certainly the news of last month really shows that there are some holes in North Americans' defenses.
Have you heard any rumors or any sort of inside knowledge as to why they stopped the search, or did they actually stop the search of what was shot down over northern Canada?
Well, I don't really deal in rumors. I deal in things. If I can hold the documents in my hand, I'll tell you about it.
Right.
But based on my understanding of what's been going on, Lake Huron in the winter is rough. It would have been hard, because if these things were in fact small Mylar hobby balloons, they would have been almost obliterated by these missiles, and the chances of finding little scraps of Mylar or metal fragments in a huge sparse wilderness or a raging tumultuous lake, I think are slim. I think they'll have a better shot finding the missile that that missed that object on Lake Huron than they will of finding the shot down object itself.
Right. Yeah. Pretty much everyone that I've spoken with, they seem to think that the 3 objects, other than the Chinese balloon, well, actually no, including the Chinese balloon, they all had prosaic explanations. It wasn't anything non-human intelligence, anything like that. Speaking of non-human intelligence, the abduction phenomenon that you hear quite a bit out here, does that receive much interest, or does it tend to be more focused on the nuts and bolts aspect of the phenomenon? Just like people that you talk to that do have some interest, do they ever bring that up?
I've certainly heard people share stories of that nature. I always find those kinds of experiences fascinating, and they're very meaningful to people sometimes. The work that I do is sort of outside of that, though. And I don't think you see too many of those stories in mainstream media outlets like the kind I'm usually publishing in. For me, what's important is that if I'm going to be putting out a story in a large media outlet, there's a very high threshold for proving the validity of what you're doing. And so, frankly, I try to really focus on documents, documented evidence, air traffic audio recordings, radar screens, things that are sort of tangible, so I can show my hand and say, hey, this is what I'm reporting on. Here is all of my homework. Here is all the background material. And I try to keep it really hyper-focused on what's being said in the documents themselves. On a personal level, I find these sorts of experience stories fascinating. And I'm always intrigued when I hear them, but it's not something that I think I can publish on for the sorts of outlets I write for, if that makes sense.
Sure, no, totally. Would you say that if you were to like rewind just a few years ago, do you think that the sort of stigma or hesitancy from the editors of publications, do you see that stigma decreasing? Are they more open to these sorts of stories?
I'd say 100%. When I started writing on the subject, my first story on the subject was published in May 2021. Early 2021, I started sending out pitches, and I didn't get too many positive reactions. I ended up starting my first stories ended up being published by Vice, who took a chance on it. They're always willing to go out on a limb and for this kind of material. And I think from there, seeing the Pentagon program, seeing news of that, seeing news of NASA's in efforts to study this, all of that is helping to break the stigma. I think people are much more comfortable having conversations about this subject now than they were 2 years ago. And I think they're comfortable having these conversations in newsrooms, in parliaments, in a government office. And that's new. And I think that has to do with, this sort of document-based approach that makes it permissible for, folks in those sorts of positions to be able to talk about it. I think the incidents with the Chinese balloon, the suspected Chinese balloon, and the other objects have also added to it. Part of my research is I actively monitor this government aviation incident database that the Canadian government's transportation department runs. And this incident database is, mechanical issues, bird strikes, drunken, unruly passengers. It all gets logged. But within this system, going back about 30 years, it's peppered with dozens of reports of unusual metallic objects or strange erratic lights. And in 2022, I was able to find about 11 reports filed by pilots seeing weird things over Canada. And now in 2023, so far, I've already found 9 reports of this nature in that system. So it just shows, I think, with the news of the suspected Chinese balloon and these objects, people are paying a little closer attention to what's happening in the skies, and they're more willing to talk about it because it's opened the doors for being vigilant about this. And I think that's good. I think we're gonna continue seeing more reports of this nature, and I think we're only going to be seeing them taken more seriously going forward.
Now, one thing that we've talked about quite a few times, and we actually interviewed former nuclear launch control officers Bob Salas and David Schindley. One thing that we've really sort of put focus on, and kind of our theory as to why the United States Air Force has really been AWOL on this entire issue, is the documented cases of UAPs interfering with our land-based strategic nuclear deterrent, our Minuteman missiles. Now, I know in Canada, Canada isn't a nuclear country in terms of having or fielding nuclear weapons, but you do, of course, have nuclear power. Are there any cases of UAPs over your nuclear power facilities?
The short answer is yes. The long answer is I don't have enough data in hand to feel confident putting out a story with that sort of correlation. But funny you should bring it up. Most of there's two large nuclear facilities near Toronto, the city where I live, and they are run by it's called a Crown Corporation. It's basically like a government arm's length corporation. This is called Ontario Power Generation, and I'm actually locked in a little bit of a freedom of information battle with them right now.
Oh, really?
I filed a request quite some time ago for reports like this. I filed with all of the nuclear operators. We have a plant, I believe, there's one in New Brunswick. There's two in Ontario. There's a decommissioned one in Quebec. And then there's a third one in my province, Ontario, that's run privately. So, I can't get access from them. Quebec said they didn't have anything. New Brunswick responded to my information request with drone reports. Ontario said they identified reports, but they're not going to release them on security grounds.
Interesting.
So that was the result of that freedom of information request. Then it went to a mediator, and they refused to budge on the issue. I said, well, you can redact portions of these records that have to deal with security systems and procedures and just leave the observations of these objects themselves.
Right.
They refused to do that. And this is an information request battle that is in the process of being escalated. I'm not going to give up until I can have those reports in hand.
How many levels of escalation are left for you to try and pry this information out of them?
So it failed through mediation, and my understanding is the next step would involve sort of a third-party investigator who would make a decision on it. And if that fails, then the only other course, I guess, would be a lawsuit.
Wow. Yeah, it definitely sounds like they're trying to hide something there. So if and I know this is pure speculation on your part, where do you see the whole UAP issue going as far as Canadian government? If you were to have a crystal ball and say where you think it might be 2 years from now.
My hope, in about a year from now, hopefully we get this report from this New Sky Canada project. Fingers crossed on that. My hope would be that, they recommend a sort of standardized reporting system with a centralized repository so reports are made available for study. I think one of the biggest things I don't want to happen is see this taken up as a military issue in Canada. In your freedom of information system, in our access to information system, material can be withheld on national security grounds. And I think in the United States, you might be able to get officials to talk to you about the subject, but as soon as you start filing requests for data, case data, citing data from the military, you get nothing because it's more or less because it's all withheld on national security grounds. I think the reason I've been so successful in my information requests here in Canada so far is precisely because our military doesn't perceive it as a defense issue. And I think it's important to ensure that, there are scientific lanes to study this material, because once you fall into that politically expedient threat narrative, I get it. It's good for getting politicians' attentions, but
right.
The ramifications are that information stops appearing. Look at the two reports that came out of the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. They're pretty vague. They're lacking in specifics. They show that they're taking the issue seriously. They're clearly mentioning that some of these things that are being observed display unusual flight characteristics, but there are no examples and there's no data. And I guess it's a really dangerous trap to have intelligence and national security organizations pick up this subject if your goal is transparency, which as a journalist, that's what motivates me.
If there are people out here that are listening to this for the first time and they're interested in this subject, especially your fellow Canadians, where would you point them to as far as a good source in addition to the stories that you write?
Yeah, there are some good Canadian researchers out there, and there's good Canadian research being done. There's Chris Rakowski is a Canadian ufologist, for example, who, if you want to have a historical perspective, particularly what was happening in the Cold War era, his material's good. For the more contemporary stuff on political, military, and aviation developments, you'd have to have a look at my work. You can find that all I list all of my stories on the topic on my personal website, which is danielotis.ca. You can follow me on Twitter at DSOtis. I'm always putting extra documents out there, also Facebook, etc. But, I think the moral of the story is there's very little data in Canada. There's very little information compared to the United States. I'm just trying to dig up as much as I can and put it out in the world.
So what would be, in closing, what would be your message to the politicians in your government?
I guess simply allow the Office of the Chief Science Advisor, allow them to do their work. Don't interfere with it. Let's see what they come up with their recommendations. This subject isn't going anywhere, so trying to minimize it is only going to backfire. I think we should be having open, honest, and earnest conversations about this. We need to rid the subject of any sort of stigma or ridicule, because as long as we have a smirk and a laugh when we hear the words UAP or UFO, it's going to stop the sort of credible witnesses that we need to come forward. The police officers, the aviation officials, the pilots, the soldiers, people, who have nothing to gain by reporting. We need to create an environment where they can feel comfortable coming forward so we can get more and better data and hopefully come close to, shedding a little more light on this enduring mystery.
Right. I totally agree, and we're all hoping down here that that our politicians continue to sort of be on top of this subject and put pressure on their colleagues in Congress, such as Congressman Tim Burchett, who's really been really just been all over this thing. But anyway, I sincerely thank you for giving us the opportunity to be the first person to talk about your story. I think it's fantastic, and you're doing really great work up there. So Daniel, thanks for joining us. And folks, if you enjoyed this show, we would appreciate a solid of you hitting that thumbs up and subscribe button. And again, we've got coming up on March 26th at noon, Dr. Gary Nolan, professor of Stanford University, who has really been an advocate on the UAP issue and always has something to say. So anyway, Daniel, thanks. Thank you so much. Thanks for your work on this topic and joining us. And we cannot wait to see your next big story. So thanks for joining us, Daniel, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Okay, great. All right, guys, thank you. We'll see you soon on The Good Trouble Show.